Hello and welcome along to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm your host, as ever, Matt Addison. Tom Beattie is with me once again as we discuss the latest Liverpool talking points, including Darwin Nunez and what comes next for the Uruguayan striker at Anfield. Before I get into the meat of the podcast, though, don't forget to get the best discount off your NordVPN plan. You can go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. And of course, there's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link with all of the information on that is in the podcast episode description box below. Let's get stuck into it, though, Tom. We'll start with the Aston Villa game midweek. Obviously, Liverpool didn't play particularly well against Wolves at the weekend, but got over the line. A 2-2 draw with Aston Villa. What were your reflections on that? I think in isolation, it's probably not too bad a result to go to Villa, away from home, under the lights and get a point. But did you come away from the game disappointed, or were you quite happy with the draw that Liverpool got?
Yeah, I think it was a test at the weekend against Wolves, and Liverpool really had to work hard for the victory there at home. And I think coming into the Villa game, obviously we know the Villa are a Champions League side, and we know the quality that they've got. They've been a little bit up and down at times, I think, so far this season, but they've got some really big results in there along the way. And we know with a manager like Unai Emery as well, that he can really set up a team well for one-off games. And, we've seen that down the years, obviously, with his managerial past as well. So I always knew it was going to be a tough game at Villa Park, and it felt a little bit like a kind of European night, didn't it? I think that game, and Liverpool had to kind of stem the atmosphere a little bit at times. And I felt like maybe when Liverpool got that opener through Mo Salah, that I knew it wasn't going to be plain sailing. And obviously Villa did come back into the game, and I think before half time to go ahead, that gave them a massive advantage in that game, didn't it? And I think on the one hand, Liverpool did well to come back into the game. You can possibly see it. If you look at it as you're coming up against a Champions League team away from home, to come away with a point probably isn't the worst result. But I think given the context of the game as well, how it went, to be in a position where you could possibly go on and win the game with half an hour to go and maybe not take that chance, I think maybe Liverpool will be ruining that kind of this morning and kind of moving forward, because for me personally, it feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity, even though Villa did have a lot of chances in the game as well.
Yeah, Liverpool still 8 points clear, very much in the driving seat, and I don't think either of us expect Arsenal to be perfect before the end of this season as well. So we've got to take all of those things into consideration. But I suppose the only sort of trepidation that I've got really is Liverpool have got City and Newcastle. They're 3 out of 5 games into this incredibly difficult and jam-packed run. I think in 15 out of 16 days, those 5 big games, there's still 2 more of those to come. Obviously, Newcastle is at home. The City game is going to be interesting because they've not been perfect. They obviously hammered Newcastle, but then got battered by Real Madrid as well. So it's difficult to know exactly what they're going to look like. But I think it's a little bit difficult to know exactly where Liverpool are at and how worried, or whether we should be worried about them in this little bit of a period. Because as I mentioned before, they weren't particularly good in the second half against Wolves. We don't need to sort of go into the details of that too much. But do you think there's a question at all in terms of tiredness at the moment for Liverpool? Because they are playing so many games. Arne Slot, maybe up until this point, has not rotated as much as some people maybe would have expected him to. Do you think that's playing a bit of a factor at the moment for Liverpool? Would you like to maybe see a couple more changes in the next couple of matches? And how important could that be for the rest of this season?
Yeah, it has been a tricky run, I think, probably since the turn of the year, really. And I think kind of throwing into the mix as well. Obviously, we had first half of the season, the extra Champions League games, but then we've also had the EFL Cup as well to deal with. I think that's maybe took it out of the legs a little bit for the Liverpool players. And yeah, you look at the situation now, and there have been a couple of drop points in there, kind of the last three games, really. We know the Everton game, that was in difficult circumstances, I think, given, again, the context of that game, the emotion involved, kind of, the last Merseyside derby at Goodison Park. We always knew that was going to be a tough test, but yeah, there does seem to be a little bit of tiredness creeping in, I think, for them Liverpool players. And I think, the manager, he seems a little bit hamstrung in terms of what he's able to do in terms of his selection. He has had the injuries in there. And also, I think what doesn't get maybe factored in is maybe having to play players into form and fitness as well. And maybe that's been a slight kind of issue for the manager. He's had the likes of Canate come back in defence, and then Diogo Jota at the other end of the pitch, where he's kind of been having to play them into form a little bit. And I think, in terms of the pair of them, they've looked a little bit rusty at times in the past couple of games, and that's probably down to fitness as well. So, I think it's a difficult one for the manager at the moment to kind of assess his options. And, there has been that issue of trying to bring players back, and we've seen a couple of injuries along the way as well. We saw, obviously, last night, Conor Bradley had to come off after being brought on. And, it's kind of instances like that make it a little bit more difficult for a manager. And, I think in terms of that selection, it's been difficult for him in recent weeks, I think. Just kind of bringing new players back into the mix for injury. And maybe we've seen that reflected in the results that Liverpool have had in kind of last 3 or 4 games really since the EFL semi-final at Anfield. So, I think it's been a tricky period for Liverpool. But coming into that City game as well, I think it is a massive opportunity now away from home, maybe to kind of right a couple of wrongs. That the past couple of away games have been really tough for Liverpool, but I think it'd be a massive statement if you're able to go to the Etihad and win.
Yeah, I think in terms of the tiredness, it would worry me a little bit more if Liverpool weren't in the middle of this run, if they hadn't had, so many games in such a small period of time and so many big ones as well. Aston Villa is always going to be a tricky one. City and Newcastle as well come with their own difficulties. Obviously, Goodison Park was a one-off occasion. That's hard enough in a normal season, let alone with the fact that it was the last one at Goodison. There's mitigating factors. I do think it's interesting, though, that he does keep picking the same players. I thought McAllister and Gravenberch looked absolutely shattered at the weekend. And then both of them are asked to go again. I think Arne Slot was asked about Gravenberch this morning and kind of said, he's not performed maybe as well as what he has done up until this point, but he's not too worried about it. But I think I'm right in saying that if he plays another 90 minutes at the weekend, he'll then have played more minutes in a single season than ever before in his entire career. Obviously, he's still young and he's still got the legs to be able to cope with that. But we are kind of just about to enter unprecedented territory with him, really. We've never seen a season where he's been asked to play that much. There's a bit of me that wonders maybe has his form dropped off in the last couple of weeks because of that and he's being asked to do too much. But Liverpool do have a couple of options. Obviously, Curtis Jones played slightly further forward yesterday. Harvey Elliott hasn't really played a great deal. Wataru Endo is there as well. Whenever I sort of talk about the midfield or whenever I post about it on social media, there's always a lot of people who come back and say, well, why doesn't he just put Endo in for a game? But I think the maximum he's played is sort of 20 minutes off the bench in the Premier League. I don't think he's really played much more than that. He's definitely not started a game in the entirety of the league season so far. So are you surprised at all that he's not maybe used the likes of Endo and Elliott a little bit more? I think possibly there's an argument to do that if the games are not quite so big. But would you, for example, think about putting Endo in against City or against Newcastle? Or do you expect Gravenberch to just sit in there and try and get through this difficult run?
Yeah, like you say, I think it was a tricky game for Gravenberch up against Villa. It seemed like Villa kind of won the midfield battle at times for me in that game. And obviously we know they've got a lot of good players. Tielemans I thought was great on the night. I thought Rodgers a bit further forward was fantastic as well. And John McGinn always puts in a good shift as well. So yeah, it was a tricky performance really, I felt from Villa. And they probably did edge that battle, I felt. And possibly that does come down to legs in that midfield, like you say, for Liverpool. And yeah, Gravenberch, I think last night, he did look knackered, really, didn't he? He looked tired, and I think that is the issue that Arne Slot is dealing with now. Maybe that rotation issue is going to come up more and more, and like I say, there's always that debate over whether to give Endo minutes in that role, but he's only kind of played, like I say, 20 minutes here and there off the bench. maybe as kind of almost like a James Milner type role of what we saw under Jurgen Klopp, maybe coming on to see out victories and see out results. So maybe seeing him in from the start, I kind of can't see it really against City. And I think that's maybe the issue, coming back to kind of, the issue of maybe whether Liverpool should have added a midfielder in January. Maybe it comes back to that. But obviously the decision was made, to stick with the options that the Liverpool had. And I think maybe we're seeing, the results of that a little bit now. The players do look tired. And like you say, the two of them last night, McAllister and Gravenberch, they did look tired in the game. And I think when you chase him in games as well, especially away from home, you maybe see that difference in terms of legs and maybe that stamina. And maybe it was one game too many for them couple of players. But yeah, Slot maybe doesn't have that option at the moment of kind of bringing them two players out, because they've been so integral to what this team's done so far this season. And you look at the amount of games that Liverpool have got left, you kind of can't see them being brought out of the team because of how important they are as well. So I think it is a tricky dilemma. And yeah, like you say, the options that are there, they're kind of not jumping out really. Harvey Elliott, first half of the season, he was out through injury, kind of struggled with fitness. Then he's come back in and he's been limited to them kind of cup games really. And I think maybe, the Plymouth away game was a bit of a fork in the road really, where, them fringe players maybe didn't perform on the day and they kind of didn't put themselves, in the manager's thoughts really. I felt in that game, maybe didn't do enough to kind of be banging on the manager's door and asking to kind of start games. And I think, yeah, we're starting to kind of see the fruits of that a little bit now as well, where, maybe Slot's kind of got to put that trust in a couple of those players now. We saw that with Klopp, didn't we, last season with Elliott, for example. He used him more than any player in terms of an outfield player last season, didn't he? Albeit from the bench an awful lot. So, yeah, it's one of them situations now where I think maybe Slot doesn't have an option in terms of maybe who to bring in. And we're seeing that a lot more now in games where Liverpool are looking an awful lot more tired, I think.
Yeah, it's tricky to balance it, isn't it? Because you could maybe throw in someone like Endo, but then he's not played. So then would he be rusty? And then would people say, well, why have you done that? And you've thrown him in and it's not really fair to throw him in. You almost can't win either way with those things. And I wonder as well whether, I think it's fair to say we've seen Liverpool be a lot more open defensively, or certainly under a lot more pressure. Certainly in the second half against Wolves, probably all game really against Aston Villa, and one or two other games in the last month or so as well, where they've looked a little bit more under pressure at the back. I wonder whether that comes back to the midfield as well, because if you've not quite got the control of McAllister and Gravenberch, maybe there's a knock-on effect, and that makes it a little bit more difficult for the defence as well. There's obviously a couple of injuries in those positions at the back. It does feel a little bit like Liverpool have been maybe not quite as assured defensively in the last few weeks. Do you think that's fair? And do you think the sort of reasoning that I've outlined there is probably the likely reason for that being the case as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think behind the scenes, like you say, there have been injuries here and there, and also, like I said before, bringing people back from the sidelines as well, in the case of Konate. And I think that's maybe been the story of the second half of the season a little bit defensively. There has been a little bit of a drop-off in terms of that performance. We saw first half of the season, Liverpool looked almost impenetrable, at the back, as did Arsenal. But like you say, in recent weeks, things have looked a little bit more lethargic, I'd say, possibly. And that does come down to, I think, the lack of options maybe at Slot's disposal. You look at that kind of settled back four that they had kind of first half of the season. I think a lot of that came down to rotation as well, kind of being able to keep people fresh. And, we've seen that Andy Robertson's, had a lot on his plate, I think, in recent weeks, and there have been mistakes there, here and there, but I think he's kind of improved possibly over the course of them few weeks, but I think the centre-half options, I think the lack of having Joe Gomez there is possibly, being a big miss for me personally. I think that he gives you a rotation option across that back four, and I think Liverpool have missed that in recent weeks. And yeah, it's being one of them where, again, the manager's been having to kind of juggle his options a little bit. And we saw, he had to bring on Conor Bradley, second half there last night, and then obviously bring him off again. And, it's kind of frustrating, I think, for the manager. You'd imagine that, them kind of fitness issues are cropping up now. And obviously he's put in Quansah at right back, but I don't think he's a natural kind of right back. He's more of a centre half. So, yeah, kind of missing someone like Joe Gomez that can kind of play it across that back line. I think it has been a massive miss for the manager in recent weeks. And, yeah, possibly that tiredness. Obviously, Van Dijk's played a lot of minutes as well, and we know how good he is as an organiser, but maybe in front of him, like you say, the midfield, the tired legs that were there. I think Dominic Szoboszlai in that more kind of advanced position in a sort of number 10 did really well last night, and I think he carried a lot of the load in terms of that running in midfield, but there's a lot of athleticism in that Villa midfield as well. We see with Tielemans and kind of Morgan Rogers, I think, was playing almost as a box-to-box player, even though he was on kind of that right-hand side for a lot of the game. So, yeah, it was just it was a tricky game. I think last night Liverpool kind of lost the midfield battle a little bit, and that did kind of put the pressure on Liverpool, I think, defensively as well. And maybe that amount of minutes in the legs for that back four kind of told, I think, for Liverpool last night. And Villa did have a lot of chances, didn't he? Kind of, the back end of that game. I think there was a big chance for Daniel Marlin, for example, and it flashed in front of goal. And I think Liverpool kind of just looked like resigned to maybe that was going to go in. And it just kind of looked like tired legs. I think there was a chance for Rodgers as well at the end as well. He had a free strike at goal, didn't he? So, yeah, it just seemed like one of them nights where maybe Liverpool escaped from Villa Park with a point, in a sense. But yeah, I think maybe tired legs are kind of coming into that now, certainly defensively.
Yeah, and Joe Gomez out for probably most of the rest of the season as well, so it's not going to be a quick fix with him. He's had surgery and isn't going to be back for a good while yet, so it's something Liverpool are going to have to get a grip on in some way. But I think probably the hope is that when the fixture list is not quite as one after the other, I know there's obviously going to be Champions League games and there's still important Premier League games to go, but having a couple of weeks where you play Everton, Wolves, Villa, City and Newcastle, that's probably not going to happen too often in terms of the sort of emotional and physical sort of demands that are placed on the players. I don't think that's going to be necessarily the case for the rest of this season. Certainly not too often anyway. Well, let's move on to the other main topic that I wanted to talk about. I mentioned him at the top, Darwin Nunez. We always seem to talk about him in some way, whether that's very good or maybe not quite so good as it was the case against Aston Villa. I think Arne Slot's reaction to him missing an open goal probably told you a lot about the frustrations that he's got with him. His comments this morning in the press conference about him were really interesting as well, in terms of his miss essentially being all right, although he'd much rather he scored. It was more the reaction after that wasn't particularly good, which I think, to be fair, probably sums Darwin Nunez's career up in some ways. We have seen that kind of thing before, haven't we? He does seem to very much be a confidence player. He's very much somebody who is aware of things that are said about him on social media and within the ground, what the general kind of thoughts and feelings are about him. He does seem to read and take in a lot of those things. Where this is quite a big question, but where are you up to with Darwin Nunez? Are you in the camp a little bit like me? I think at this point where I've almost got to the stage where I'd be surprised if Liverpool didn't bring in another forward in the summer, mainly because of him really at this point. Yeah,
for me, it was a frustrating showing last night, I've got to be honest. And yeah, it was one of those games where he's coming on as an impact player, really, isn't he? And we saw on the flip side of things over a month ago now, out of Brentford, obviously you got those couple of goals that got Liverpool over the line that night. But yeah, the flip side of things is that he comes into the Villa game and, there's a couple of massive kind of opportunities in that game that I think games like that, they swing on a knife's edge a little bit. And we saw towards the back end of the game, obviously, that the Villa had a couple of chances that we referenced before. But I think the lion's share of Liverpool's chances in that kind of final half an hour, that the best chances kind of came to Darwin Nunez on the night. And I think the one that was kind of an open goal, he should kind of be putting that away. And maybe the one where, Martinez obviously comes out to close out the angle, but possibly that bit of intuition or bit of striker's instinct has got to come into play a little bit there. Maybe kind of chip the goalkeeper, go round him, something like that. A bit of magic, I think, was missing last night. And I think, like the manager touched upon, he does kind of seem to be a confidence player, really. And I think that's kind of tricky when you're coming off the bench as kind of an impact substitute. If you are to miss a chance, possibly being able to dust yourself off and go again and kind of be assured that, you're going to get chances, in the rest of the game. I think that's kind of the mindset you've got to have, particularly at a club like Liverpool. And yeah, like you touched upon there, the comments from Arne Slot, I think that was really telling. Obviously, he said straight after the game, the Darwin seemed kind of disappointed maybe to have missed that chance. And like you said in the press conference, it's maybe that mentality afterwards that you're able to dust yourself down. That's kind of what he's looking for. And I think, yeah, like the manager kind of said, that is the disappointing thing. And I think when the manager is making comments like that, that's kind of putting the onus back on the player a little bit, I feel. And you're hoping in the second half of the season now, what remains of the second half of the season there, he is able to kind of show what he did in that Brentford game, for example. We think back to the Newcastle game last season, he was able to obviously get that goal. There was the Forest goal, wasn't there, last season. He is able to make an impact as a substitute or, kind of affect games in terms of that chaos. But yeah, I think kind of looking forward to the summer now, I find it very difficult maybe to see him having a long-term future at Liverpool. Obviously, he's had a good go of things for 3 years now. And like you said, it's kind of, that's been the story of his Liverpool career, really, hasn't it? It's been stop-start at times. For every Brentford goal or Brentford winner, there's been a game like the Villa game a month later where maybe he's had them couple of chances to get Liverpool over the line and he hasn't been able to do it ultimately. And it is a tricky one now, I think, for obviously the recruitment team to kind of assess. And obviously I wouldn't be surprised if he was to stay at Liverpool. The amount of forward players on the market at the moment, they're kind of sparse, really, aren't they, in terms of options that are out there. But yeah, I think he's got to kind of be making an impact, I think, in kind of the second half of this season now. And you're hoping that maybe this is a turning point for him. We've looked at other games in the season where you're hoping that they would be the turning point, but you're hoping this is going to be a game that maybe gives him that bit of, fire in his belly to kind of dust himself down. And I think that the comments on social media as well, he does kind of seem frustrated, doesn't he, with kind of how things have gone for him recently. And hopefully he uses that as kind of motivation, I think, in what remains of the season now.
Yeah, he's such a hard player to try and describe or assess. And I think he's someone who probably needs a run in the side, partly because at the moment he's just in his own head a little bit. And he's, as we've said, a bit of a confidence player. He needs a run of games. He needs to feel like he's the main man. But I just don't really see a route to that being the case at Liverpool. I think the fact that Curtis Jones, I don't know whether he's ever started a game for Liverpool on the left wing as a senior player. Obviously, he used to play there as a youth player and played further forward. But really, in his time with the seniors, he's only really played in midfield. I thought it was telling, really, that Chiesa and Darwin Nunez are on the bench, and yet he's put a midfielder on the wing instead of one of them, or maybe Jota on the left and Nunez through the middle, or there were enough options there that included Darwin Nunez starting that game. But then you think back to the Wolves game when he came on, he was absolutely atrocious in that game and was even worse really in this one, and didn't really go out of his way to show that actually, it was a mistake not to start me, and you've really got to put me in the team for the weekend. It just didn't quite work for him, didn't quite happen, and I'm just not quite sure what the next step really is for him. I mean, looking ahead to the summer is, as we've spoken about, plenty of times in terms of transfers throughout January, is a number 9 a priority for you? I think we've seen with Diogo Jota again this season the sort of inconsistencies of fitness. Obviously, Nunez is inconsistent in a different way, but is this a kind of reminder, really, of that is a position that Arne Slot and the recruitment team need to be looking at in the next few months?
I think so, certainly. I mean, you look at last night and I thought Diogo Jota, although he seemed rusty in terms of, missing chances, he was bright in the game. I think that's kind of what he brings you in terms of just being alert to chances and maybe being able to get in behind. And I think he's just better kind of linking the play and that sort of thing. In an ideal world, he'd be fit every week, and I think he's more than good enough to be leading the line for Liverpool. But we've seen over the years that he has been at Liverpool that it's just been very difficult to keep him fit. And I think, the manager now will be looking at that situation and thinking, well, on the one hand, you've got Darwin Nunez, where there's not that reliability. He's never kind of found that consistency in a Liverpool shirt. And then on the other hand, you have got a player who has showed consistency, but unfortunately has kind of issues with fitness. So they're your two kind of options in that number 9 position now. So I kind of agree with what Jamie Carragher has said in the media recently, and I think John Aldridge wrote a column on it, didn't he, in the Liverpool Echo as well. Maybe that is that kind of problem area now for Liverpool. If you are to improve on the options that you've got, I think maybe looking at that centre-forward position. And obviously there is still that question mark over whether Mohamed Salah is going to be at Anfield next season to do with his contract. He's kind of scored, obviously, the lion's share of Liverpool's goals so far this season. I think he's on 24 now in the Premier League, which is astounding, really. I think kind of having that in the back of your mind, obviously you're hoping from a supporter's point of view that Salah does stay, but I think that the centre-forward position for me would be one that I'd be looking at, certainly. And obviously there's been people kind of weighing up options, who's kind of out there. And I think that's maybe the only issue, is that maybe there isn't kind of many options out there. People mention about Alexander Isak at Newcastle being maybe a player that Liverpool should look at, or maybe even Arsenal as well. But you look at Newcastle's situation there and you kind of think, do they need to sell? He's obviously under contract for a while there, and possibly this summer isn't a time where Newcastle necessarily need to sell him. So I think there is a bit of an issue there in terms of who's kind of on the market. But yeah, I think ideally that would be the position I think Liverpool should be looking to strengthen in. And maybe also, like we've mentioned in previous weeks as well, maybe that midfield position, we're starting to see with tired legs now, that maybe another body there mightn't be a bad idea as well.
Yeah, just a last point, really. I thought Robbie Fowler was quite interesting on TNT Sports in the UK. He kind of was asked about Darwin Nunez, and he basically said, like, he's got to be a little bit more savvy, a little bit cleverer. Maybe that sort of comes down to instinct that he doesn't quite have. You mentioned before the time when Martinez comes out and you think, just knock the ball past him and he'll bring you down, and then the referee's got a decision to make. Or if you manage to knock it past and jump round him, then you've got an open goal to hit, which obviously not necessarily the case that he would have definitely scored that, but it would have been nice to see him have the opportunity to do that. It just feels to me a little bit like you've got the clinical finisher when he's fully fit and firing in Diogo Jota. You've got a bit of an inconsistent option with Darwin Nunez. We're not quite sure exactly what Arne Slot wants in terms of his number 9, but I think it would be fair to say that he wants probably more goals than either of them have been able to provide this season for various reasons. But he wants a little bit of that link-up play as well. You mentioned Salah, and that will come into it, but there is a world, isn't there, where Liverpool could bring in a number 9 and still have Mohamed Salah firing, and those two could work together. So it sometimes feels like when you've got a player like Salah, everything has got to go through him. But it wouldn't take much, I don't think, for a number 9. If Diogo Jota had stayed fit for the full season, for example, he'd have been getting 20 plus goals. I think it's fair to say it's just about getting that balance right, isn't it? And finding the option that hopefully can complement Salah next season, but also can maybe do a little bit of the other stuff, because it's probably fair to say that Nunez isn't clinical, but he doesn't always do the sort of link-up play, the pressing, that kind of thing as well. I'm just not quite sure exactly what he is, which is probably a little bit of a problem 3 years into his Liverpool career.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. There's still big question marks over kind of a style of play, whether he can play with his back to goal. And I think it's been quite telling as well that Arne Slot used Luis Diaz in the number 9 role quite a lot so far this season. I think that says an awful lot about what kind of the manager thinks of his options. Obviously, he's had one hand tied behind his back with Jota for a lot of this season in terms of injuries. But yeah, I think when you've got a player like Darwin Nunez there sitting on your bench and you're using, a traditional left winger as your centre forward, I think that kind of says an awful lot about what he kind of thinks of Darwin Nunez. And I think also as well, that the problem maybe comes down to, like you say, not only that lack of consistency, but, maybe that lack of a kind of striker's instinct, maybe, when he has got that option to kind of, take a chance or, maybe force a goalkeeper to make a mistake, as was kind of the case last night with when obviously Martinez did come out of his goal. He's not there to kind of take them kind of options up. And I think that's maybe the frustrating thing, for the manager, because all he can do is kind of set that team up to create chances at one end and keep it tight at the back down the other end. And I think that's maybe why the manager will be frustrated with his strikers and maybe his centre-forward options at the moment, because like you say, they are creating chances. It's just at the moment they are missing them. And I think, ultimately you need a striker to be putting away those chances, and you need a striker who's available every single week, ideally, which is what you've got with Mohamed Salah on the wing, but possibly not kind of at centre-forward. And, Luis Diaz is Liverpool's second best goal scorer so far this season. I think he's got 9 goals so far, and maybe that's kind of why, Slot's been using him in that centre-forward role at times this season, that he knows he's a player with an eye for goal, and maybe when them chances do come, he maybe has a bit more trust in him to kind of put them away, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly something for Liverpool to think about heading into the summer. I'm sure that will be on the agenda for them if there is the right player out there. I think it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it, at this point for them to go and do that. But listen, I'm sure this won't be the last time we speak about Darwin Nunez before the end of this season. I think that will be the last time we speak about him on this podcast, though. We will leave it there for this week. Thank you to Tom for joining me. Thank you to everyone at home as well for watching along and listening as well. We'll be back next week with the next Liverpool.com podcast.